Welcome to the module Preparing for the Mathematics EOG. In this session, we will look at some Cumberland County data and use this data to identify some areas for remediation as we prepare for the Math EOG. The expected outcomes of this module are to analyze the data. Like I said, we're going to look at benchmark data and some EOG data to identify some focus areas for math review. We're going to look at some suggestions for solving word problems. And then the last thing that we're going to do is take a look at some strategies for solving problems involving fractions, because overall the trends are showing that fractions ends up being one of those weak areas. The first thing I wanted to do was just look at each grade level's data from the EOG, and then each grade level's data from that third quarter cumulative benchmark. And remember, that third quarter benchmark, we were asked to make it cumulative, which means that it did have some things possibly from fourth quarter on some of the grade levels. But we'll take a look at that in a second. So hopefully this makes sense. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break down some of the EOG data right here and try to look at trends within the data. So the first thing I did was I wanted to see the percentage of the test items on the EOG and which items were most heavily tested. So third grade, there's three items or three areas, three domains that are most heavily tested, and that's the OA standards, the fraction standards, and those MD standards. So now those are the main hard-hitting areas in third grade. Out of all of the areas in third grade, the weakest two areas that we performed on, or the lowest proficiency levels that we had, were in fractions and measurement and data. So already you're seeing some trends here of, okay, two of the highest tested areas were also two of our weakest areas. And then the other thing I looked at was the difference between our scores and the state's average. And the three areas that had the greatest difference, two of those three areas were also two of the most heavily tested and two of our weakest areas. So if you had to pick a couple areas to focus on for review, it looks like that would be fractions and measurement and data. But let's go ahead and compare this to that cumulative third quarter benchmark, just to make sure that this is still some areas of weakness. And yep, it's looking like fractions here and measurement and data, those are some areas of weakness, definitely. I want to point out that those fractions items, now a lot of the fractions content had not been taught at the time of taking this benchmark, so that data may be skewed a bit. However, looking at the big picture, because fractions is so heavily tested and fractions was an area of weakness on the EOG last year, I would still say it would be really safe to go ahead and just remediate in fractions and measurement and data. So we'll look at some tips and strategies for remediation in a little bit. Let's take a look at that fourth grade data. Again, in fourth grade, what I started off with was looking at the highest percentage, or the domains that had the highest percentage on the EOG. And here we can see that's the NBT standards and the fraction standards. And then I wanted to look at what were our lowest areas, the lowest scored areas. And you know what? I just realized the NBT, I shouldn't have highlighted that. So let's look at just these two other areas. That's the OA standards and the measurement and data standards. Those are our two lowest areas. So it's interesting. So far, there's not a consistency here, which is good. If you had to be weak in something, you would want to be weak in the areas that aren't as heavily tested. So that's a good thing for fourth grade. But now let's look at the difference from the state here too. So there's three areas that had the greatest difference from the state. But if you had to look at trends now, I would probably say remediating with your OA standards and your MD standards, that would probably be a good way to prioritize your time. But before we go ahead and make that decision, let's go ahead and look at that cumulative benchmark and see what that data says. Okay, so our EOG data said OA standards and those MD standards, and yep, it's looking like this benchmark is telling us the exact same thing. It is interesting to note that the OA standards, there's almost no green, which I was thinking that, well, maybe the OA standards hadn't been taught yet this year, but the OA standards had all previously been taught prior to that benchmark. So this is good, accurate data right there. The MD standards, which I said is another area that we might want to prioritize our time, Most of those standards have been taught. There is a line plot standard that had not been taught, maybe one or two others, but a big chunk of this benchmark was on area and perimeter, and our students were weak in those areas. So taking that into consideration. One more thing I wanted to note was it does show that fractions is a weak area. However, that is also because some of those fraction standards had not been taught at this point of the test. So the best suggestion for this point is to look at the trends in the data between the EOG and the benchmark. So probably a good place to prioritize some time would probably be those OA standards and those MD standards in 4th grade. Let's look at that 5th grade data, and then we will look at some strategies for instruction. In 5th grade, I highlighted NBT standards and those fraction standards as being the most heavily tested. I think most of us are aware of that. And then I highlighted the weakest standards for us, which standards we scored lowest on. And that would be, again, the NBT standards and those fraction standards. I also highlighted the gridded response just because I thought it was interesting that this was so much lower than the other areas. So just one big thing for 5th grade is just making sure you're practicing doing the gridded response, and that number should come way up. And then the last thing that I looked at was the difference from the state. And this is, 5th grade is really easy to see that the needs for remediation here based on this data would be those NBT standards and those fraction standards. One more thing I did want to note, that graded response, that it was almost 5 points below the state. I'm hoping that's because some counties may have been piloting those graded response items for the state, and they started using it long before we knew about it, because we didn't find out about graded response until pretty late into the year. So I'm hoping that now that we knew about graded response from the beginning of the year, those scores should come way up. Let's look at some trends between the EOG scores and the benchmark, the cumulative benchmark. And here it's showing those fraction standards and those NBT standards, which overall it looks like this would be a great place to focus on because that's what the EOG and the benchmark are telling us. This is pretty accurate information because both of these domains had already been taught prior to this benchmark testing. So definitely these would be good places to prioritize time. If I had to pick one of the two, obviously I would pick fractions because that is 50 to slightly over 50% of the test. Now that we've talked about some of the data, I wanted to pinpoint a couple areas that we could focus some remediation on. One of the things that wasn't seen in the data was this need for really digging into word problems. The data alone isn't going to tell us that. The data will identify some domains to focus on, but what I saw was I was able to get to look at some of the field tested items that DPI has released, and one of the things that I really noticed was anytime there was a word problem, students struggled. Anytime there was a multi-step word problem, many students struggle. Then the next thing that I did with that information was I went and pulled the 5th grade released EOG test that was put out by DPI last year, and I noticed that 70% of the EOG was word problems, and I don't mean just easy word problems. I'm looking at like 70% of the test was multi-step, really rigorous, rich word problems that students are not going to be able to solve correctly by just taking the numbers and doing something with them. They're only going to get correct answers if they're doing some really good close reading on the problems and really digging into what the problem is asking. One thing I wanted to say here is that in literacy, in ELA, we're teaching kids to visualize, to do close readings, to analyze text, to annotate text. But when we get into math class, all of a sudden we're telling the kids, here's some words, and if you see these words in the problem, this is the trick and this is what you do with it. But we're not teaching them that close reading. We have to treat these math problems like we are treating reading passages in ELA. So one of the tips I'm going to say is focus on close reading these word problems. Focus on visualizing the word problems. One of the other things that DPI is now doing is when they develop word problems, especially, well, multi-step word problems, they are putting bullets in the word problem so that students can see the problem broken down for them, and all they need to do is then do that close reading and make sure that they're reading each bullet, and then they will be more likely to get the answer correct. So one of the things students need to do is, if there are bullets, make sure that something in their work represents each of those bullets. The last tip that I wanted to show you was DPI has on their wiki, there is a section that has the field tested items, and at the bottom of each of the field tested items it says the percentage of students that chose each answer choice. This is a great opportunity for your students to analyze these errors and figure out, why did kids across the state choose A versus B? Or you can even do this with your class. Put down the percentage of answers that each student said and analyze why people chose those different answers. This is a lot more rich than just saying, okay, which answer is correct and why is that correct. For example, this is a third grade field tested item. 60% of the state got this answer wrong. 60% of the state just took the 3 numbers in the problem and did something with them. They just added, when this really is a multi-step problem and they needed to do a couple more steps here. I believe it was only 27% of the actual state of students taking this last year got that answer correct. So that would be a good conversation to have with students. Here's a couple more examples. Here's an example from the benchmark, the cumulative benchmark. And it's interesting because only 20% of the kids had this answer correct. 70% of the students in Cumberland County all chose the same wrong answer. And the reason they chose that same wrong answer is because they stopped after the first step when this was a 2-step problem. So having those conversations with kids could be really powerful. The next thing that we need to be doing is making sure that we're identifying a really good problem-solving strategy that's consistent across the county. This is a strategy, before you start reading it, this is a strategy that I want you to not use, and I'll show you why. Here's a word problem. The cubes strategy says to circle the key numbers. I just did that. It's going to tell us to underline the question. And then it's going to tell us to box any action words. And when I dug a little bit deeper into this, I discovered action words is pretty much the same as keywords. So you would box any keywords and then you would solve the problem. Well, I just did this whole strategy without ever actually reading the problem. So I just eliminated my close reading, my visualization, all of those good, rich literacy strategies that we're taught to do when we read a passage in reading. I didn't do any of those with this math problem. So one thing that you could be doing instead is the stop sign strategy. And I suggest that if you use this strategy, use it across the board in every grade level. So when we get to 5th grade, we're not spending all that time teaching how to do the strategy. We're just going to do it. Just to review really fast, if you haven't seen this strategy, you read the entire problem once just to get the gist of it. Then you reread and you stop at the commas, periods, question marks, the word and but, and you're going to visualize by, draw a picture or take some notes or highlight any important information, and then you keep doing that throughout the problem. You solve the problem and then you check to make sure the answer makes sense. Pretty simple. The last thing that I wanted to focus on was just some suggestions for helping students solve problems related to fractions. And these suggestions could actually be used for whole numbers as well. So any grade could really use these strategies. But the biggest thing that I'm seeing in 4th and in 5th grade is that students have been taught all these different operations related to fractions, but there's really no part in the year or in the standards where it says, okay, now consolidate that information and solve problems using any of those 4 operations, or know when to solve, know which operation could be used to solve a problem. So we need to build time into our reteaching, our remediation, and into our pacing to do that. Here's a couple tips for looking at problems and knowing when to use which operation. So a couple of ways we can practice this with students would be to give students an expression and then have students find the situation that could match the expression. And I love this word problem. This was a field tested problem on the EOG last year. And it gives you that expression 1/2 divided by 8, and then it says, okay, now which of these situations could match that expression. Another tip is to give students several problems and tell them only some of these problems you could use multiplication to solve them. So here's a couple examples, and the students would have to figure out, okay, which of these problems could be solved using multiplication. And I will tell you, if you do this with your students, that let me see, it's the first one that can be solved with multiplication. and the last one could be solved with multiplication. Another idea that you can use with students to practice distinguishing between the different operations and knowing which operation goes with which type of situation. I call these pinch cards. You can call them whatever you want, but pretty much the kids would have a cardstock card with the 4 operations, and they could just pinch the operation after reading a problem. They would pinch the operation that could be used to solve the problem. The key is not to focus on solving the problem. They wouldn't actually be solving it, because a lot of times students can compute. They just don't know how to think about the situation and think about the operation that's associated with the situation. So they would just focus on that part and probably skip the computation part and just focus on the situation. The last tip is to have the students create their own situation. I call this one headline stories, because a headline is just a brief snapshot of what the big story is. And just like in math, an expression or an equation is a brief snapshot of the whole problem situation. So if you gave the students the headline or the equation, 1/4 times 5 is equal to whatever, students would have to create a math situation or a math problem to match that. Because if they can generate a situation that makes sense of that equation, they could do the opposite, hopefully, where they're given the problem and they have to identify the equation to match it. So hopefully these give you a couple tips or a couple ideas of things that you could be doing with your students as you get ready for the EOG. And if you have any questions, if you need any more information or want more strategies, please feel free to email me, Dawn Coker at ccs.k12.nc.us. Thanks. Have a good day.